This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Roger McEowen, K-State and Washburn law professor, starts the show by reviewing his recent blog article, Rights of Co-Tenants. He explains the issues that can come from estate planning and ownership. Continuing the show is K-State Farming Systems Specialist Ignacio Ciampitti as he talks through soybean planting considerations for row spacing, seeding rates, and planting dates. The show winds down with K-State's Brad White, Brian Lubbers, Dustin Pendell, Bob Weaber, and Bob Larson with another segment from the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast discussing using safety techniques when working with cattle. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show talking about a blog article with K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Shelby.
Roger, this article is titled Rights of Co-Tenants, and as we're talking about co-tenants and co-ownership, how does that sometimes happen?
Well, it happens often when we see estate plans done for farmers and ranchers, and it may be a pretty simple estate plan, and maybe the parents wanted it done this way. It's not the suggested approach, but sometimes clients want to do things that they just want to do, and so you do it for them. And what I'm talking about is where you leave farmland in co-equal ownership to multiple children. So if you have 4 children, for example, the farmland would be owned, and each child would have a 25% undivided interest in the entire farm. And that can lead to problems down the road.
And an Illinois case highlighted the issues that can create.
Well, yeah, not just with respect to the farmland itself, but with respect to subsurface minerals that are left in co-equal ownership, and that's what that case involved.
What issue did you see between these two trusts that dealt with mineral and surface?
Well, there were a couple of trusts that were created as a result of estate planning for this family. So you got 2 different branches of the same family owning interests in 2 separate trusts. And one trust had a 50% interest in the mineral estate and farmland, and it claimed that it had acquired the other 50% interest held by the other trust by adverse possession, which is an interesting claim. We don't see it come up too often with respect to minerals and the subsurface estate. We see it all the time in agriculture with respect to the surface estate. And the trial court issued summary judgment for the one trust saying, no, they did not adversely possess your minerals, so you win on that one. And they filed a counterclaim for that trust, filed a counterclaim for accounting, claiming that the other trust, the parties that owned the other trust, that had removed and sold oil and gas from the mineral estate without the other trust knowledge or consent, and that the title insurance company falsely issued a title insurance policy declaring that the trust that went ahead and developed the minerals had merchantable title to 100% of the minerals in the mineral estate. So the title company was acting on the basis that this trust had adversely possessed the other 50% of the minerals and issues a title policy to them saying, you own 100% of the minerals. Well, as you can imagine, the other family members that held the other 50% interest in this other trust were upset about that. And so they sued. They sued the title insurance policy for slander of title. They sued the other trust on the adverse possession issue. And it just was a huge mess.
And is there a point where that trust could have adversely possessed all of those rights?
Well, the court never really got to that issue, but I'll address that issue for you because it may come up on remand. So there were a bunch of procedural moves in this case. The case is not over. It's going to go back to the trial court on remand because what the court said here was, and you have to pay attention to this in each state, there is a specific procedure with respect to mineral rights in terms of a state law that has to be followed if you're claiming the ability to use those minerals as an undivided co-owner. If there are split interests that are involved here, these fractional interests, these undivided fractional interests in mineral estates, many states have a statutory scheme that has to be followed to get approval for one co-owner to start developing those minerals. And that's what they said wasn't done in this instance. So on the remand, they've got to go back through this to see if those statutory requirements are triggered. But they never really got to that adverse possession issue at all. I wish they would have, and maybe they will on the remand.
And so we're talking about Illinois, but what does this mean for Kansas?
Well, every state has its own adverse possession statute, and Kansas has its unique statute on this, and it's fairly typical of many states, but it says that you can't adversely possess or you can't claim title, let me phrase it that way, to somebody else's property unless you have been in open, exclusive, and continuous possession of that property, either under a claim knowingly adverse or under a belief of ownership for a statutory period of time, which is 15 years in the state of Kansas. Now, Kansas does not have what's known as a hostility requirement. Other states will include a hostility requirement in their adverse possession statute. In other words, without permission of the true owner. So that's not in the Kansas statute. So once you satisfy the elements of the Kansas statute, this open, exclusive, continuous use of somebody else's property for 15 years, and they don't stop you from that, then you could file a quiet title action in the district court to have the title reformed to the property to reflect the area that you were using adversely to the other owner. So that's how the statute works. Now, the question that wasn't raised by the court is, well, will an adverse possession statute apply to minerals, subsurface interests in the property?
And does it apply to minerals? How do you think that might play out?
Well, it depends. That's an interesting question, which I went ahead and raised in my article and answered it to my own satisfaction. We'll see if the court addresses this issue. I hope they do, because we don't have a whole lot of case law on this issue. But when you separate out the mineral estate, the mineral rights from the surface rights, so we're talking in terms of minerals, oil and gas and metals and so forth, you do get this question of how does this requirement of an adverse possession statute, where you have to have open and exclusive use that's contrary to the true owner. In other words, it's the true owner can see that somebody else is using their property and the true owner doesn't do anything about it. How does that work with respect to minerals that you can't see? The only way you would know that somebody is adversely possessing your mineral rights and using them contrary to you is they are using them. They are developing them. In other words, you can't just say that I own your mineral rights because I have owned the surface adversely to you for 15 years, therefore the minerals come along with that. Well, no, that's not necessarily how this works. So just simply acquiring title to the surface doesn't necessarily mean that the subsurface minerals are adversely possessed. There has to be exploration or exploitation of the minerals that satisfies the adverse possession statute. But if you actually go ahead and, depending on your state law, but if you actually go ahead and start developing those minerals, that'll start the clock running on the adverse possession statute. So it's an interesting question. It doesn't come up that often, but that's what we would have to look for to satisfy an adverse possession statute is actual usage, actual development of the mineral estate.
For people who own the mineral interest, is there a way they could protect it?
Yeah, as a mineral interest owner, to protect yourself against a possible adverse possession claim, just go ahead and lease them out to an active company. I think that's a good approach because that's going to establish that you have started a viable use of the mineral rights that is ongoing. That can't be adversely possessed against you if you are the one that has started to develop the mineral estate. But just not developing it could potentially open it up to an adverse possession claim, though unlikely, because if you see somebody that started to develop your mineral interest, you're going to say something. You're not just going to sit there I would assume you're not just going to sit there for 15 years and not say anything with somebody else developing your claim, so to speak. So it's an interesting question. We do have a lot of mineral estates in subsurface states that have been separated out from the surface estate, and that's another thing that you would have to have here. You would have to have a separation of the subsurface estate from the surface estate and development of that subsurface estate for the possibility of adverse possession to apply.
And Roger, as we kind of bring our conversation full circle again, wanting to mention estate planning and really, as comes to this topic, really important for people of the older generation to think about for their younger generations?
Well, that's how we got this Illinois case to begin with, was by virtue of estate planning. You ended up with farmland that was co-equally owned by different people of the same family and actually a couple of branches of the same family. And you could have minority interest owners that are asserting their rights. So, for example, if I have farmland and 4 children and I leave my farmland co-equally to all the children, they each have an undivided 1/4 interest in the farm. Well, if there's a tenant on that farm, I had a tenant is there after I pass away. 3 of my children want to continue the lease, but I have one that doesn't, the one that has a 25% undivided co-equal ownership with their siblings, sends notice of termination. Is that effective? When they only have a 25% interest, well, they have 3 siblings that have the other 3/4. The answer is probably no in that situation, although I'll tell you there are court cases that are surprising on this that can cut the other way. Just don't do that from an estate planning standpoint. There are other ways to address that problem of satisfying a goal of many parents to treat the kids fairly or treat the kids equally. And equal and fair don't mean the same thing, and that's another topic for another day. But just leaving the farmland equally to the kids generally is a bad idea.
And Roger, if people would like to read more on this blog article or other articles, maybe learning more about estate planning, how can they do that?
You can access my blog by virtue of my website, which is Washburnlaw.edu /WALTR. I also share these with AgManager at K-State.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much.
That was K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. I will link his article, Rights of Co-Tenants, in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Wednesday show talking about soybean planting considerations, and we're joined by farming system specialist Ignacio Ciampitti to talk about it. Ignacio, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Shelby, for your time.
Ignacio, as we're thinking about soybean planting, the first thing to consider, row spacing.
Yeah, I think that row spacing is one of the key factors, and we'll walk through, the other 2 other components that it might be key management for soybeans. But when we are thinking about row spacing, we have done a lot of research on farm studies looking at benefits from narrow rows, wide row spacing. And I would say that, and there was a conversation already on this topic, but I would say that one of the key elements when farmers are deciding to move into a 15-inch or 7.5-inch row spacing is really connected to that ability of the plants closing that canopy faster. So we are looking at, for example, studies, on-farm studies on 30-inch versus 15 inches. And then one of the things to get out of it quickly, as a question is the yield improvement or yield benefit. Sometimes are there. Sometimes you get 1, 2, or 4 or 5 bushel increments. Sometimes it's the same between the wide row spacing versus that narrow rows. I think that one of the key aspects that we tend to see most of the time is that in season and the ability of those soybean plants to close the canopy faster. I will note this as an important element because if you think about, if we really think about maximizing yield, and trying to increase that green plant and biomass, what we call the biomass, we really want to make sure that we're closing the canopy as fast as possible. And if you think about the other element that is one of the big challenges for soybean farmers across the state, on weed control. We know that weed control, one of the key aspects to becoming a better manager of the land and controlling weeds is how we can close that canopy faster. We have detected and we have data. We show that these 15-inch usually tend to close canopy in many situations between 1 or 2 weeks earlier. In some situations, depending on the conditions compared to narrow rows. And that will happen more when we are looking at 7.5-inch. We're going to close a canopy, and mainly the effect is because we are putting those plants closer to each other, and the only effect that we're doing is increasing the competition quickly and making that canopy to close as fast as possible. That's one thing. So, and I think that is one of the key elements when you're looking about narrow rows and the potential benefits of narrow rows on soybeans.
Is there really ever a time where 30 inches row spacing is better?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I would say, for example, situations that if you are starting the growing season, usually very, very dry conditions, I mean, we usually tend to see that 30-inch might do a little bit better if the growing season continue to be a drier one, mainly because that 15-inch or that narrow row, whatever is the row spacing, what it will do at the end of the day is going to basically increase that water consumption. So we will be taking more water for those plants, and then it's going to happen faster, no? One of the challenges, if you don't have timely rains, unless you are under irrigation, but unless you don't have timely rains, one of the big challenges is that those plants, they will be running out of water. Sometimes it could happen around the critical time when the plants are forming pods or filling those seeds, and then that narrow rows could be a potential negative effect, mainly on situations where we are really under drought conditions and then under situations that we have very dry growing. That's the main point when you are comparing basically the difference between narrow versus wide row spacing.
Another thing for growers to consider when thinking about soybean planting, seeding rates.
Yeah, seeding rate is another factor. I mean, we have done a lot of studies and we have data on seeding rates. And if you look at all the different seeding rate options for soybeans, I mean, if you look at historical data on seeding rates, farmers tend to go really high in seeding rates. And then the last years, I would say the last decade, our seeding rates, they tend to go down, mainly because these new soybean varieties, they can branch. So branching is what we call branching is called branching a plasticity trait. The plasticity means that the plant can have flexibility to produce more branches. And mainly what it does is compensating. And because of that trait and plasticity, that we are seeing that we can reduce. The last several years, we have been reducing that seeding rate. And then today, you see that in many situations, we are between 120,000 seeds per acre or 100,000 seeds per acre. I always say if we can get 100,000 plants in the field, we have a perfect stand. I mean, and we need to realize that sometimes from seeding rate to final number of plants, we need to quantify the potential impact or factor of standability and emergence. No, I mean, we need to think about the emergence is usually, depending on the growing conditions, could be 80% or 90% if you have perfect growing conditions. So for getting 100,000 plants in the field, you just need maybe 110,000 seeds on the planting time. There are situations that if you are in a drier environment or if you are in a more challenging soil condition, early season, we need to go up a little bit on the seeding rates just to make sure that you get compensate for that kind of a germination and emergence, problem. If you look at late season, we usually, when we talk about late planting soybeans or we talk about double crop soybeans, we usually tend to suggest or recommend, moving from these 100,000 or 120,000 to 10-15% more. Just because, remember that when we are going late in the season, June, July, these soybean plants, they tend to act as a more individual plants. They have less ability to branch because the season is very short. And mainly that we are increasing the number of plants so they can produce more and more opportunities for producing yield. If you think about just another last reminder on the seeding rates, we might also recommend to increase just a little bit, maybe again 10% on seeding rates on early season, only in situations where we have problems on sections of the field, if we have compaction or if we have any issues connected to pH or any other nutritional deficiencies. Any sections of the field that we see that the plants are struggling, those are the sections that are having a little bit more plants and that they can compete and close the canopy faster is a really good recommendation. And we have seen that in many situations we are increasing seeding rates in those areas of the field that we have lower yields and in really good high-yielding areas like 40, 50 bushels, 60 bushels. In those areas, by just having 100,000 plants, target that seeding rate maybe 110, 120, we are in a really good spot. Ignacio, as growers have decided the row spacing and seeding rates, when should they be getting into those fields?
Well, planting date is window for soybeans is very broad, and we usually tend to mention this to farmers all the time. It goes all the way from
almost today until, I would say, the end of June, and depends on the conditions of the part of the state. So, and I would say, if your target is to maximize yields, and if you're trying to look at basically increasing and pushing for very high yields, planting early is and how early, the question is, if you have good sun temperature, around 55, 60 degrees at 2-inch, and we don't have any projection in the coming weeks of that temperature dropping, and if you have good moisture, go ahead. I mean, that's the key. We know that every time that planting day is delayed, we're going to lose yield and yield potential. But for the rest, I mean, in many situations where we are not looking at very high yield, that planting window is very wide. And then I always recommend to make sure that you diversify and you try to plant fields, different dates, mainly just to maximize your probabilities of increasing profits. If you have all your fields planted within a week, and if we have stress conditions, as we experienced last year doing early August, mid-August, most likely what's going to happen is that we're going to lose most of those fields. We're going to lose a lot of yield. By just diversifying your planting dates, more if you are not looking for very high yields, it's going to help you to basically increase that minimum yield that you can get and make sure that you have more probabilities of basically getting better profits overall.
For those growers who are putting this all together, if they have any questions or are needing more information, what's the best way to go about finding that?
Well, all our information in terms of seeding rates, row spacing, planting days is going to be available in our e-update newsletter in agronomy. So you need to go to agronomy at KSU.edu and then just go into the e-update.
Ignacio, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us a few thoughts around soybean planting.
Thanks again for the invitation.
That was Kansas State University farming systems specialist Ignacio Ciampitti talking about soybean planting considerations for this year, specifically looking at row spacing, seeding rates, and planting dates. If you'd like to read more on this topic, you can do so by finding the Agronomy e-updates. To do that, you can go to eupdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. Again, that is eupdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. I will link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net. Also in the show notes will be an article from Ignacio that was in the April 11th Agronomy e-updates titled Soybean Row Spacing in Kansas. Following these e-updates is a great way to stay up to date with what is happening when it comes to crops throughout this planting and growing season. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because when we come back, we'll be joined by the Beef Cattle Institute for another segment of their Cattle Chat podcast.
You're tuned into Agriculture Today. I'm Jacob Cloughton for Shelby Varner, and we end today's show with Brad White, Brian Lubbers, Dustin Pendell, Bob Weaber, and Bob Larson from the Beef Cattle Institute.
For me personally, I like to put this on the back burner and not spend a lot of time thinking about it. So help me put it on the front burner or give me some tips I should think about safety-wise on my operation.
I'd start with facilities and equipment. That's one area where we can get into a lot of trouble. And several of us have not necessarily experienced the animal direct injury, but the animal moved a piece of metal and caused us to be injured, right? And so I think, making sure, don't ignore when the teeth on a gear are stripped off. Make sure everything is clean and well maintained. And at some point, some of those things might need to be replaced. And I know that's hard to do sometimes, but when you think about the consequences of safety, it's not just rise in insurance premiums, but really, it's, could be a death of somebody that works on your operation. And that's not what we want to have on our hands.
Dustin, what are your thoughts?
Growing up, first time we had a bunch of cows. They're always pretty calm. There was always this one that this baldy that would always stay away from you and didn't think much of it. But, first time calf went out there, wanted to see the calf. Well, I learned pretty quick. I learned how fast I was. I was really fast. But that first time stuck with me, and I've always been very cautious, thinking about, at least with calves. In fact, I don't even get very close at all. If I can, I just stay away.
Well, and I think you're right. And observing the body language, because often, and she was telling you something, and they'll tell us with body language, and if you're experienced, you know what to look for. If you have somebody on your operations that's not experienced, make sure they know what to look for. And Bob, I'll turn to you. What should we look for to tell me that maybe a cow's going to be trouble?
Particularly, if we think about these recently calved cows, they're sort of, big hormonal change. They're in protect my baby mode, right? And so that cow will often try and place herself between the predator, you, and her calf, right? And so just being aware of what her initial response is. And one of the things that often we'll get, and I know even in our own cows, when I go out to approach a calf, that your sort of natural thing is to go directly to the calf. But try and make sure that you get the cow between you and the calf to start with, to sort of put her a little bit at not like, oh my gosh, somebody's going to get my calf mode, right? So just animal being aware of your position relative to the calf helps a lot, because then you give her the opportunity to give you some feedback about how is she feeling about me approaching her calf, right? So, and a lot of times those cows will, they'll either vocalize they'll start talking to their calf, right? And the calf, the little butt, and then she's, right? That's a big warning sign, like the foghorn's going off, right? If they put their head down and start pawing, you've applied enough pressure that you should release that pressure and retreat, right? And so, if you keep pushing, she's going to come at you. And so, that, positioning of cow between calf and you is a sign that she's on alert. And then she will keep escalating that until, she feels the threat is insufficient to warrant a response. So,
Bob, at the meeting that we were at, we talked a little bit about OSHA, and we may have to come back to that, but I want to talk through some of the things you learned, like things like maybe don't ignore it the first time.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was we were at an Academy of Veterinary Consultants meeting. One of the main take home was a lot of times everyone involved in the organization, owners, employees, whatever, see maybe a near miss, or they see something that could be a safety problem. And the speakers really wanted us to say, well, take that seriously and go fix it. And it might be, might need a welder, you might need a cutting torch, you might need to nail something up, but learn from the near misses, or think ahead and picture what could be a problem and take action. And I think that's the main thing about safety is if you see a potential problem, take action. And that takes a culture and a habit to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. Good safety tips, guys.
That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.